Hi, I'm Andrea. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series highlights the University of Chicago's collective commitment to the highest aspirations and standards in research and education. Today, you will hear from our world-class faculty and enjoy stimulating conversations on critical topics, all in the comfort of your home.
We extend our appreciation in advance to our global university community for their collective efforts in supporting the mission of the university in today's deeply challenging environment. Technology has allowed us to remain connected and engaged, and tonight, you too will be part of the conversations. A couple of notes. All participants will be muted. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have issues with audio, you may want to shut down your programs running in the background or dial in from your phone.
Hi, I'm Colin. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, we offer our deepest gratitude and appreciation for your continued support. We're proud to be part of this community as it has come together during these trying times to invest in our students, empower our faculty and scientists, and extend care and connection. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 41st season of the University of Chicago's Harper Lecture Series. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy.
Welcome to today's Harper Lecture, The Cost of a Cleaner World, with Professors Michael Greenstone and Amir Jina. I'm Deneen Gillespie, Director of Alumni Experiences. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, we want to thank you for joining us. Please allow me to introduce our moderator. Amy Harder is the Vice President of Breakthrough Energy Publishing. She is one of the top national energy and climate change reporters in the country, having built up a reputation over a decade of being uniquely balanced and influential journalist with respect across the spectrum. She joined Breakthrough Energy in early 2021 to launch a new journalism initiative covering the opportunities and challenges of the energy transition. She also writes on these topics in her regular Harder Line column for Axios as an outside contributor. Before joining Breakthrough, Amy worked with Axios shortly after it launched in 2017. In that role, Amy reported on trends and exclusive scoops while also distilling into understandable formats complex energy and climate issues relevant to people outside of the industry. Previously, she covered the same issues for Wall Street Journal, based out of the DC Bureau, and before that at the National Journal, also in DC. She was also the inaugural Journalism Fellow at the University of Chicago's Energy Policy Institute. Amy is also very active on social media. You can follow her on Twitter at Amy A. Harder. Professors Greenstone and Jina, thank you both for joining us. And Amy, I'll hand things over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Deneen, for that great introduction. It is such a pleasure to be back somewhat with you. I know it's unfortunately we can't be joining in person, but I do look forward to the day when I can take another trip to Chicago. It's great to be here with you today. I'm joining from Seattle, Washington, which is very sunny today. I remember one of the first conversations Michael and I had when I was a fellow at the school, that he informed me that Seattle could be hit particularly hard with climate change because most buildings don't have air conditioning. And so I can confirm the building I live in does not have AC, and it regularly reaches the mid 80s inside my apartment. So at least Michael gave me a fair warning on that. He doesn't really need an introduction, but I will give him one anyways. He's the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics. He's also the director of the Becker Friedman Institute and the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. He previously served as the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, where he co-led the development of the United States government's social cost of carbon. Amir Jina is an assistant professor at the Harris Public Policy. And forgive the sirens, that's one of the many joys of the remote work environment. Amir is an environmental and developmental economist. His research has focused on the role of the environment and environmental change in shaping how societies develop. He uses applied economic techniques combined with methods from climate science and remote sensing to understand the impacts of climate in both rich and poor countries. He's conducted field work related to climate change adaptation with communities in India, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Uganda. So Michael and Amir will give a brief presentation, and then we'll have a discussion among the three of us about these topics. And please ask questions throughout. As a reminder, you can submit questions anytime by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I also may work in some questions into our panel discussion if it seems relevant. And then also toward the end, I'll also get to some questions. So we'll try to get to as many as possible, and please don't be shy. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Michael.
Thank you, Amy. I hope the sirens are not for you and that you'll be able to be with us for the full hour. Always a great pleasure to be with you and Amir. So I thought I would talk, Amir and I put this together just to kind of level set. And let's see if I'm capable of doing this. Level set on a few facts that might be useful for seeding our discussion. So the people often like to talk about the climate change or the climate crisis, and there is absolutely a climate crisis, but I think it's often useful to think of it slightly more broadly as a global energy challenge. And what defines that global energy challenge, I think, are three goals that all societies have to contend with. They're all illustrated in this picture. The first is societies are desperate for access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy. And this is a picture from Beijing, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And you can actually feel like the incredible economic progress that Beijing and China have made in the last several decades. It wasn't very long ago that the guy in the car was probably on a bike, and it won't be long till the guy on a bike is going to be in a car. And so the first challenge is, how do you make sure that advances in living standards are so critical for people's well-being can be accomplished? The second is that the very same energy that helped produce those great increases in living standards is also producing this terrible, terrible smog. This is the middle of the day in Beijing and you can't see the sun. And so the same fossil fuels that powered all this economic growth have also caused all this terrible pollution and the health effects. It's not a secret to the guy here. He's wearing a mask. And so the second leg of the stool is, how can you have high local environmental quality and health while also using lots of energy? And then the third leg of the stool, I like to think of, is the same fossil fuels that have powered all this growth and that have produced all this pollution are also increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. And so what societies have to do is find a way to balance or trade off those three different goals. And now I'll just provide some facts that kind of, I think, level set on at least how Amir and I think about it. So the first is the need for continued growth in energy consumption is incredibly acute in many parts of the world. So here in the state of Bihar in India, where there's 100 million people consume about 200 kilowatt hours per person per year of electricity. In the United States, it's about 13,000. So they're like off by a factor of 65. All of India is maybe off by a factor of 10. And even China is, only about a third of US energy consumption. And so it's no surprise then that in the coming decades, there's just going to be lots of increase in energy consumption. It's all going to come from today's developing countries. So fact two, and this is really important, is in the last several years, there have been reductions in the cost of clean energy or non-fossil fuels. So here in red, we've got solar, and in black, we have wind that were almost unimaginable a decade ago, the reductions in solar and wind, and then these very dramatic reductions in batteries. And so they're beginning to change the game so that and we'll take a look at that in a minute, but they're beginning to change the game so that low carbon energy sources can actually compete with the fossil fuels. But as of today, fossil fuels do remain less expensive. And I'm going to say this very important, it's ignoring their externalities or their health effects or their carbon effects. And you can see that, and that's how most governments decide. And you can see that here with some data from the United States, where the price of natural gas generated electricity is about 4 cents per kilowatt hour, and all kind of versions of renewables, be it wind or solar with a natural gas backup or with a battery backup are much more expensive. And so if you think back to Bihar, India, like effectively choosing a low carbon energy source is asking them and asking the United States to buy electricity that is 2 or 3 times more expensive. In transportation, the story is actually quite similar, maybe even harder. And there at a current price of oil, the batteries would have to cost $57 per kilowatt hour for an internal combustion engine car and electric vehicle to cost the same over their lifetimes. Unfortunately, the current price of oil, the current price of batteries are about 3 times that. So there's been a lot of progress in electric vehicles and batteries, but not enough yet where the economics would dictate purchasing electric vehicles. So fact 4 is in the background, of course, the climate is changing, and I think most people on this call, everyone on this call knows this. Here's a good version of that. And you can see we have in front of us a kind of very aggressive emissions path that would have, by the end of the century, temperatures 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. Amy would certainly have air conditioning in her apartment by then, or less aggressive versions that would require very large reductions in emissions. And I will come back to that in a minute. And so I think, so why did the university ask Amir and I to come talk about this tonight? I think it's because we are helping to run something called the Climate Impact Lab, which is this group of climate scientists, computational experts, and economists who are trying to produce the world's first empirically founded estimates of the cost of climate change. And you can see all the happy faces here of people who are working quite diligently to produce this. And we'll give you just a little flavor of some of the things we found. This is from some work on what the impacts of climate change will be on mortality around the world. The headline is that these overall impacts are about 10 times larger than we had previously understood. And this is a consequence of we have collected the world's most comprehensive data. But what I really want to emphasize in this slide is how different the effects are projected to be in different places in the world. So you can take a place like Oslo, which is in the blue here, and actually they're projected, because they're going to get rid of their very cold winters, to have very large reductions in mortality. But that has to be counterbalanced by what's going to happen in other places in the world, and a really good counterbalance is in Accra, where there's projected to be very large increases. And what you can see is that where a lot of today's developing country populations are located, and so these are the places that are, we're expecting to see very large increases in energy consumption. They're not well positioned with respect to climate change, and the trade-off for them is going to be even sharper in the sense that the impacts of climate change are projected to be terrible in a lot of those places, and yet these are the same places that are going to need lots of energy to continue to grow. I'm going to just talk about, this is kind of a summary of some of our work across a lot of different sectors. I think we probably don't have time for the details, but as I said, we're finding much larger impacts on mortality than had been previously estimated. With respect to energy consumption, actually, we're finding much smaller impacts. And The Biden administration is actively engaged in updating their estimates of what the total cost of climate change will be. And I think there's a sense that a lot of the work we're producing could be useful to them. Okay, but let's just step back and come back to what, from research, but to what the world is confronting. And so the scientists often talk about we should be on a 2-degree emissions pathway. And it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to actually just look at what that would require. So the black line here is historical emissions. And then these are examples of how emissions would have to be cut if we were going to comply, or the world were going to reach 2 degrees, stabilized temperatures at 2 degrees. And it's kind of shocking because you kind of have this kind of slow and steady, regular march upward. And then effectively the world would have to have this very sharp decline that we have kind of no historical precedent for. And now let me try to pull the pieces together here for a minute. Given the raw trends that are projected to unfold, that what makes the global energy challenge so tough and challenging is that the reductions in emissions that the world needs to stay in 2-degree pathway have almost all got to come from China and the rest of the world, or today's developing countries. And why is that? That's because that's where all the emissions growth is projected to occur. So even though the United States has played an outsized role historically, we're projected to play a very relatively small role going forward. And so however we're going to get there, if we're going to stick to 2 degrees, these bars have to come down. And these are the very places that are so desperate for additional energy consumption. So it's just useful to do a drive-by on where are we on policy. I would just describe current US policy as pretty piecemeal and often pretty expensive relative to estimates of what the benefits are of reducing CO2. That is not a terrible description of what's going on around the world as well. The price on carbon in the world is about $2.50. If you use the Biden administration's interim estimate of what the benefits are of reducing carbon, we should be willing to pay up to about $50 per ton. And so you can see we're very, very far from that globally. There's by historical standards, we spend relatively little on energy R&D. So that's another area where we could be doing more. And so I think to date, there's really been pretty modest global climate policy ambition. But I don't want to end on a downer. So let me say, well, where is there a ray of hope in all of this? And I think the ray of hope comes from what has been going on in the last few years, but especially in the last year, is really a much more aggressive announcements about countries' desires or plans to make themselves carbon neutral. And so here's just a map of the countries around the world and when the date that they have set for themselves. None of this is binding. Maybe in Europe it is, but to be carbon neutral. And relative to 5 years ago, this looks a lot better. And so I think coming out of kind of 4 years of lots of deregulation in the US around climate, and the arrival of the Biden administration and these kind of international movements, I think if we're going to see some rays of hope, a lot of them lie there. So why don't I stop there and turn it back to Amy, who will lead us in a interesting discussion, no doubt.
Hello again, everyone. Michael, thanks so much for that presentation. So I want to open up with a question that kind of threads a lot of what you just shared. The way I view climate change is that it's presenting us with two sets of costs, both that will likely come independent of one another. The first is the cost of shifting to clean energy, and also the cost of adapting to a warmer world. the costs associated with the latter, adapting, will occur now and into the future, almost inevitably for decades, even if we do move forward as we are aggressively to shift to clean energy. And of course, there's huge opportunities for job creation and, obviously helping the planet, but also from an economic perspective with creating jobs. So just to open it up to both of you, how do you compare and contrast these costs, and how should societies weigh them in terms of their policies going forward?
First of all, thanks for moderating this discussion, Amy. It's very exciting to have you here talking to us again. I think one of the things that we try to do a lot with our research is to try and make sure that we are, first of all, thinking about the balance that you're talking about. So what you often hear and what often gets thrown around is just how expensive it is to transition to clean energies, how expensive it is to deal with climate change, how expensive it is to mitigate. But what we're really trying to do is fill out the other side of that equation and say, every single dollar that you spend in reducing our emissions, every single dollar you spend in reducing the causes of climate change is one which saves money. It has benefits around the world in terms of health and other things. So I think just on your first, the first part of this, it's us trying to say, let's not just focus on the expense purely of climate policy. Let's focus on this as an investment in future of society, future of the planet, etc., and try and make sure we have the hard numbers on the other side of that to understand what the benefits are. The trade-off with adaptation is a harder thing, because we know that one way or another there will be a price tag. Either we spend to avoid damages, or we spend to cope with those impacts. And I think rather than give a very detailed answer in how we might think of that trade-off, I think one of the important things to raise is exactly where we will be spending money in both of those cases. If we were to not spend the money to avoid climate change, the wealthy countries will have the resources to adapt. Their poorer countries most likely won't. And so the world here, the costs aren't measured just in terms of the total dollars damage that we experience. It matters who experiences them as well.
Yeah, and maybe just let me add, I think Amir raised a very important point there, that one theme that comes out of our work is, as Amir said, rich countries are in the fortunate position that a lot of what they'll be able to do is to adapt by spending money. So, just using your apartment as an example, for sure, your apartment will have air conditioning in a few years, and you'll happily spend money on that. And in a lot of other parts of the world, people aren't wealthy enough for that. And it sounds nasty, but the way that they're going to adapt is by suffering real compromises in their life. And I think that can often add up to shorter and sicker lives. And what it underscores is, like, climate change is not a good thing, and it's going to impose costs of different kinds in different places. And some of that will be extra spending that we will do in rich countries to protect ourselves. And some of that will just be, people will be exposed to, much harsher living environments.
You guys have both brought up such an important point that I think in this year of the pandemic, it's been highlighted in so many tragic ways, but that these double costs of transitioning to cleaner energy and adapting to a warmer world, that they hit most harshly the poorest people and the countries who have contributed to the problem the least. I mean, Michael, you pointed to Norway. Maybe we should all pack up our bags and find some property there today. And the Southeast Asia, who are still trying to grow their economies, are just going to get hotter, and they may not be able to afford an air conditioning unit, for example. So what are some policies that are either in place or being considered to really ensure that they don't get hit twice? And are those policies something that will be, acceptable to the wealthy countries that unfortunately seem to drive some of these global decisions?
Yeah, I think the just thinking of this in the international context, that's written into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that there is this distinction between the wealthy countries who have historically caused climate change and who should be the ones transferring some kind of resources to the countries who are currently developing. The idea being that there are a set of countries who will absolutely have benefits from increased energy use, and particularly it would be better if that energy use doesn't have to come from fossil fuels. And so one of the main things in thinking about this international inequity and what the impacts are is trying to look at and focus on the climate financing type policies that are in place, adaptation funding, funding for clean development that already exist but are generally kind of underutilized. And that's one area where I think the climate negotiations that will happen at the end of this year has potentially and hopefully has a lot to say, and to see some renewed commitments there. But that's one of the ways to create that direct linkage of saying, yes, the mitigation is, first of all, much cheaper in many cases if it happens in poorer countries. And so can we set up some kind of financial mechanism to invest in that?
So Amy, can I just share screen and show this map again? I think it kind of is poignant. I think I just, I went over this quickly, but I just want to come back to it for a second. So like the blue regions are the regions that are going to benefit. And as I mentioned, also is going to benefit. And you can see there's these just wildly large areas in terms of geographic mass, square miles. But that's not where the people are. And the people are here. And when you look at this map, or when I look at this map, you just think, holy smokes, like all these people want to go here and here and here. And we have such a terrible time as a world with migration and the political difficulties of migration and borders and cultures. And like, how are we going to manage that? You're going to have a lot of people in places that are very, very difficult to live, and a lot of wide open empty spaces that are going to look a lot better. Where you could buy land in Oslo or you could buy land in Canada, and it's going to be much more desirable than it is now.
Well, Canada is certainly closer to Seattle. That is so great that you brought up that question. I don't know if you saw it in the chat, or if you're just thinking along the lines of Nicholas here, who asked that question about climate migration. Amir, why don't we just kind of bring that question in? He writes that you mentioned poorer countries will pay a larger price in health, comfort, etc. What about the movement from people from southern poorer areas to more northern or southern areas? Can you guys could you speak to that, Amir? So
first, we're trying to do research on that. It's one of the biggest questions that comes up. What will people do? What about the movements of people? As Michael just pointed out, it sounds like a good adaptation strategy until you, look at any part of recent or even ancient history and look at what happens when there's been some need for people to move en masse from one country to the other. It's not an easy thing to achieve. So while it does seem like it could be there in the portfolio of adaptation strategies, I think in practice, politically, it becomes a lot harder. In terms of what we know, if we just take the US, for example, what we have is, rather than people moving away from hotter locations, we see the opposite happening. We see people migrating towards cities in Arizona and Texas and Florida, and those cities growing quite quickly because, we have air conditioning there. People are able to move to hotter places. Whether or not the climates will become so extreme, the energy bills will become so expensive, the wildfires, all the associated risks will increase to the extent where we start to see the reverse flow happening. It hasn't happened yet, although in seeing things like the fires of last year, I think many people are thinking about migration in that way. In terms of these really vulnerable countries that we've been talking about, migration internationally is expensive. It's a costly thing. It's costly in terms of just money, but also costly in terms of the social network you leave behind in terms of what you have to do. It's not something that's really within the means of a lot of people. And so kind of assuming, yes, people will move to, parts of Siberia as the permafrost melts in this new agricultural land or something, that's likely to only be a select group of people. Credit constraints mean that the really hard hit people who can't, who don't have access to bank accounts, loans, anything, those people who are likely to be more hard hit are also likely to be the ones who just can't avail of an adaptation strategy that involves migrating around the world.
Great. I want to talk about your slide, Michael, that you had about fossil fuels being cheaper than renewable energy. And I have a couple of questions on that. But the first one is sort of the quite big parenthetical about excluding externalities. Now, you've been beating the drum on the efficiency of a carbon tax for as long as I've known you. What's your latest thinking on this? So the Biden administration seems to not really be pushing it at all. They're not necessarily closing the door, but it would appear to directly violate, the president's pledge to not raise taxes on people making less than $400,000 a year. Do you think it will ever happen here in America? And if not, would you ever endorse a plan B?
Yeah, no, I've been predicting for a decade that the coming fiscal crisis for the US was going to make a carbon tax look like a great idea. And so I've been wrong for a decade. I think there is a possibility. They're obviously not pushing that. The clean electricity standard you could think of as a carbon tax inside the electricity sector only. They are pushing that. I think it is, I'm always surprised at the resistance to it, because the resistance kind of has two features. Hey, you're going to disproportionately hurt poor people, or you're going to disproportionately hurt our carbon heavy industries, and that's unfair because they're going to have to compete with China who won't do anything. But like, both of those are totally design features of a carbon tax that could be fixed. You could have all kinds of rebating in a progressive way that would fix up low-income families and make them probably even better off. And you could have border tariff adjustments that would actually protect the heavy fossil industries in the United States. So I continue to think that is the right and best strategy. Because at the end of the day, I think there are limits to how much we're going to want to spend to address this, and it'll be the cheapest way. Whether or not the politics will align to allow that, that's a more difficult question. But just because I've been wrong on my political predictions for 10 years, I think does not mean that the economic prediction is wrong.
Have you tried to present this idea to your friends in the administration?
I think it is probably not a new idea to them. My sense is that their judgment is that they would like to have someone else champion this idea, or come in at the end and say, hey, wait a minute, we want to pay for all this stuff. Where's that money supposed to come from? Couldn't a carbon tax do that? And I think, given the history of fighting about carbon pricing, that could well be, very shrewd on their part.
I want to bring in a question from one of the audience members, Michael, who sort of asks a good follow-up question to this topic about how to address this problem. And he asks, to what extent do government subsidies and or tax incentives make fossil fuels less expensive than renewable energy alternatives like wind, solar, geothermal? And then sort of the follow-up to that, that I'll add is, what do you make of what has been the U.S. government's policy to date on climate change, which is just to throw a bunch of money at R&D and bring down the cost of these renewable energy technologies by having tax incentives and such?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's one thing that has been, sometimes we miss, like, even through the Trump years, there have been pretty aggressive policies to favor low carbon energy sources through production tax credits and investment tax credits. And I think the reduction in costs that I tried to show at the beginning in those technologies, it's hard to pinpoint what portion of that is due to those policies, but I'm confident that some portion of it is. I think there are, just because a carbon tax is most efficient does not mean that there aren't plenty of other good policies out there to be had. I think they should be pursued. The global energy challenge and the climate crisis demands, I think, that we be searching not in a religious way for the best way to fix it, but for practical ways that are beneficial on net.
Would I be able to jump in just on the subsidy point? So as much as there might be explicit subsidies towards fossil fuels, there is, kind of picking up on the point that you pulled up on, Michael, without thinking in the bringing in the cost of the externality, there is this implicit subsidy, which is, we know that the price of the emissions from fossil fuels are not free. They're not costless. They're causing damages around the world, and that cost is being borne by somebody somewhere. In some cases, it's being borne by us in the US. In many cases, it's being borne much more by people in the more affected areas. And so there's this implicit subsidy as well, where we're just not paying for the damages that are caused by a lot of the electricity we're using right now.
Well, let me agree with Amir, who I think is agreeing with me. So there's
as a reporter, I want to get you guys to disagree.
We'll find a way. Actually, we can talk. I have some things I disagree with Amir about. But it's a very unlevel playing field when it comes to energy. And that's kind of what that was buried in what I was trying to say. And Amir said it very well, which is like, hey, if you're running a coal plant or a natural gas plant or some other fossil fuel plant, like, you're causing damages all over the world, nearby, all over the world, and you don't have to pay for that. And it's like completely like inequitable. We have such an easy solution to that, which is let's just penalize you by the amount of damage that you're doing. And that would help level the playing field. But right now, there's a very unlevel playing field.
So how can, I think obviously the great work you guys are doing at the Climate Impact Lab and the social cost of carbon is really part of this, but how do you, in the global diplomacy space, how do you get these sort of non-monetary costs to be on par with the monetary costs? Because, you're constantly seeing, the monetary concerns take precedent, even though the health impacts of these things really should be above and beyond that. Amir, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, I do, but probably not a very sophisticated one. I'm the naive researcher who I just hope, we get the numbers out there and people see, oh, this cost is just so large, we can't ignore it. We can't stick our head in the sand anymore about this. And that's a naive view because, partly I became a researcher because I believe the numbers are what we should be paying attention to. But the political story domestically within every country and particularly internationally, it's an extremely hard one to try and tackle. So my hope is that as our group and a lot of other groups are starting to tally up these costs. We've been doing this research for me personally for a decade and other people for decades, just adding up these costs. There's rarely a moment where someone says, oh, great, look, here's a positive effect of climate change. You might see that locally in some place, but on net, we're just finding more and more costs, increasing costs, impacts that we didn't know about. And the hope is that at some point that just becomes too hard to ignore.
Yeah, I think I want to come back to how it is really global climate change, and any solution, I think what makes it like such a hornet's nest, or as my former friend who unfortunately is not alive anymore, Marty Weitzman, said, it's the problem from hell. And I think it's the problem from hell because the problem looks so different depending on where you are. And so, like, if we're here in the United States, what we're really worried about is protecting ourselves against the really bad version of climate change, which might come, but we don't know. There's some probability about that. And so we're willing to pay something for that. If you're like in India and you're like, it's living on 200 kilowatt hours of electricity per year, like your first and second and third thought is like, I need to grow today. And there's no way, like, it's very, very challenging to think that like I should buy electricity that is 2 or 3 times more expensive to help my future, my children, when like today I'm like leading this very compromised life because of my low incomes. And so like you have these people, it's called the United States, it's called India, it's called Sub-Saharan Africa, who see the same problem so differently and for very good reasons. And yet like solving the climate problem requires actually coming to a common understanding of what the problem is and how the problem should be solved. Now, like, and this is where maybe Amir and I have slightly different views. Like, I think he thinks like the UN is all going to get together and the US is going to put big piles of cash in and send them over to India or Bangladesh or something like that. And I have very little confidence. I think it'd be very challenging to run for senator, even from the great state of Illinois, on a platform of what I'd really like to do is subsidize energy in India. And so I think those kind of international transfers are going to be hard. And that's what makes the climate problem so hard, is you have countries who see the problem so differently, and yet they kind of all need to act in the same way.
Amir, do you have a rebuttal to that? Are you really an eternal optimist to Michael's somewhere between a realist and a pessimist?
I'm probably not an eternal optimist, but some optimism does get me out of bed in the morning. No, I hate to disappoint you to not have any conflict here, but I think I agree with Michael largely. Like it's a hope that there might be some binding commitment, but I don't think that the US is going to just completely subsidize the rest of the world's transition to clean energy, nor even that that's the right thing to do. And so again, going back to my kind of putting on the researcher hat of like, let's look at the numbers and see what we can do. Thinking about this as not just a government problem, an international politics problem, thinking about it from the point of view of businesses, from the financial industry, from infrastructure, urban planning, seeing ways in which every single one of those subsectors of the economy is affected by this, and trying to give each of them a unique number, number tailored to them, saying like, this is a problem for you as well. Those are ways in which I think that the motivation happens. Probably not, I probably have a little bit more hope than Michael in the international negotiations sphere. But I do think that by itself, it's going to be wildly insufficient.
I mean, I don't, I don't want to be too much of a like the Dark Prince here. I think there's lots of things that we can do that are probably in our interest and are beneficial for the world, like R&D to drive down the costs of low carbon energy. No brainer. We should be spending way more than we are. And that's something that will benefit the world and will benefit us.
So we have just a couple minutes before I kind of take more audience questions, and we have a ton of engagement. So thank you to everyone who is chiming in. I'll try to get to them all, but we probably won't. So stay tuned, come back for more events, and hopefully you'll get more chances to engage. There's a couple of questions about different energy technologies and the cost of them. So I want to ask a couple questions on that. One about nuclear energy. There's always a few people at events I moderate that seem to be real champions of nuclear energy, when there's a lot of people who are more skeptical. So bringing in those questions, to what degree do you see nuclear energy, either existing plants or sort of the modular, smaller ones that are being developed? I guess sort of a two-part question. What role do you see existing nuclear power, either here and abroad? And then also, do you see the cost of advanced nuclear power coming down to a place where it could make some economic sense? Michael, would you want to start on that?
Sure. Look, we have fallen in love for some reason with like solar and wind. I think solar and wind are great. But the planet does not care if the electricity comes from solar or wind or nuclear. with respect to carbon emissions. And yet we have all these policies. 30 states have renewable portfolio standards. I don't think a single one treats nuclear in an advantageous way. And so I think we have to decide, like, are we going to be ruthlessly searching for the cheapest forms of abatement? And if we do, I think that would put nuclear in a better light than it is right now. I honestly think nuclear's core problem, though, right now, it is not treated fairly with respect to its carbon freeness, but it is also very expensive. And I think that's its core problem, and it's just hard for nuclear to compete right now because of the raw economics of how expensive it is.
Could a carbon tax fix that?
Sorry?
Could a carbon tax?
Yeah, carbon tax would help. A carbon tax would help. I think depending on how large the carbon tax is, though, natural gas could. I think with a lot of carbon taxes we've seen, natural gas would still beat nuclear. Or a lot of proposals for carbon taxes, you'd still see natural gas beating nuclear, but in certain settings, it would be have a better chance. And I think these advanced nuclear technologies, I suspect, Amy, you know more about them than I do, but I'll just say, like, we should be turning over the cards and finding out what's there. We don't know, I think, and we should be investing in R&D to find out what's there. And if some of them turn over and they look great, that's awesome. And if some turn over and they look so great, it was, I think, for sure worth the bet.
And a specific follow-up question about one of your slides, Michael, on the costs of renewable energy versus fossil fuels from L. Cantor. This person writes that the PowerPoint comparison uses hydrocarbon-fueled electric energy generation versus renewables seem to use the cost of existing renewable plants rather than the plants coming online this year. So the person is writing that, I mean, is it true that renewables are more expensive than gas plants? Is that still the case? Because it seems like the data is really showing otherwise, that renewable energy is even cheaper, even on a non-subsidized basis.
Yeah, okay, so not true, like everyone says it, but it's basically not true. There are some settings, particular settings where it's true, but what it misses is that renewables, as the favorite phrase goes, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And so they're intermittent. And so you have to have something that fills in for the periods when when they're not operating. And it is true that their cost of producing a kilowatt hour of electricity can be less expensive than a natural gas plant, but only if you ignore that socialized intermittency cost that they impose on the rest of the system. And so what that chart tried to do was show two ways that you could make them pay for it. One, you could build a natural gas peaker plant beside them and only run it when necessary. And the other is you could use batteries. But they're getting closer and closer. But I think in a fair accounting, in most settings, they're not there yet.
So a question from Jay McLean, right along that same lines. Given what you just said, what accounts for all of the media reports and also politicians suggesting that renewables are already cheaper? Why is there this perception?
They ignore the intermittency costs. They ignore the intermittency costs. But I don't want to be too negative. Like, there's just been so much progress. Like, they're so close. Like, compared to 10 years ago, like not that long ago, you couldn't have imagined the cost reductions. I think you would have sounded like a crazy person. And now they're getting close. There's no doubt.
I want to ask a question from Elliot. He asks about trade and climate change. President Biden says international trade should be central to his climate policy. This seems to mean enforcement and compliance, that the US should set high environmental standards for manufacturing and tax imports. Does this type of approach to international trade and climate change make sense to you? Have you other ideas about international trade and climate change? I'd love to hear from both of you on that, Amir, particularly from your experience working with developing countries, how that could fare with the trade debate.
Well, so there's lots of things on the table about about trade, and in particular, I mean, I'd be interested in hear Michael talking more about border tax adjustments and other things like that. Just to kind of like go off on a little bit of a tangent from that question, there is an important component of trade in terms of how we measure emissions as well, which I think doesn't get enough recognition. So in Michael's slides, he had this thing of showing China has a lot, like extremely high emissions, 30% of global emissions or something. A lot of that is for consumption, which is not occurring in China. That's producing things which are produced elsewhere. And so this again comes back to this global aspect of this problem, which is, China would not be at 30% of the world if it wasn't producing things for the rest of the world to consume. And so thinking about that as just China's problem is also not the right way to look at this issue. That's true of many developing countries. I think where this starts to get really salient is that with low labor costs, lower production costs in many developing countries, they are the factories of the world now. And to penalize them for the emissions that are going towards consumption in the rest of the world is probably the wrong way to look at this. So I agree that I think it's like an essential, it's something we can't turn away from when we're looking at how emissions develop over the course of the next few decades.
Look, I would just add to that, yes, the US should have border tariff adjustments, but first we should actually have a national climate policy. And so you can't have border tariff adjustments until you have a national climate policy. And yes, it should be part of one, but you gotta get the US policy up and running first.
Do you think the Biden administration could pursue this type of trade policy absent a national policy?
I think it would be hard because you would then have to go to WTO and describe why it's not just discriminatory. And so I think, I did work on this in the Obama administration, and it's thorny. It would be thorny to implement. I think the lawyers believe it can be implemented, but different countries have very, the EU has a cap and trade, so they have a clear price on carbon. But compare that to the United States, which we have this hodgepodge of regulations, and how do you weigh which one is more stringent than the other? Like, it's not impossible to come up with estimates, but it's pretty thorny, and I'm sure it would be a terrific employment program for international trade lawyers.
I want to bring in a question from Jason and bring it back to our conversation about renewables and nuclear power and other technologies. He asks, how do economists think about the cost of the decrease in reliability that comes from the replacement of dispatchable generation with renewables? Can you qualify the value of reliability? And I would add to that, you showed, Michael, the decreasing costs of batteries. Is there going to be a point where that doesn't plague renewables, and when will that be?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I'm going to not. I think I don't know when that will be, but I think it's not the only path, but a really probably the clearest path to decarbonization has the following feature, which is decarbonization of the electricity sector. That's going to require batteries to help fill in the gaps. And so not using natural gas peaker plants, which have fossil fuel emissions or carbon emissions. And then moving to electric cars that get effectively plugged into the grid. And the common weak point in both of those things is the same thing, which is batteries. So like no one's going to buy the cars until the batteries are cheap, and no one's going to green the grid until the batteries are cheap. And so kind of the whole world, this is not the only path to decarbonization, but kind of the whole world is sitting around looking at the battery scientists and being like, guys, you got to get together. And there's a terrific team of battery scientists, material scientists at Chicago and at Argonne, and we certainly have interacted with them quite a bit at EPIC. And they're working very hard, and I think it's a very, very hard problem to solve.
Great. The sirens just passed again. So you ended just in time, Michael. Thanks for that. That brings me to one of my questions I would like to bring back in. To me, it seems like the discussions around the Paris Climate Agreement and a lot of these climate discussions are centered on, understandably, reducing emissions and the urgency of that. But what I see missing is an unfortunate critical part, which is the cost of energy to consumers. How much do you think that should the economic ministers of all these countries, should they be the ones leading the annual climate conferences by the UN? Because we've seen this around the country and the world. People revolt when there's higher energy prices, and so how should energy costs be appropriately factored into these debates about climate change? Amir?
That's an excellent question. I think there was always this dictum in the past, which was, the environment ministry is probably not the right ministry to think about these vast sweeping changes that need to happen within an economy, because they don't control the purse strings. The more you can get the parts of government that do control the financial flows into that decision, into those processes and into decision making, I think is incredibly important. And we've seen that happen quite a lot. This is an issue where central bankers are starting to pay attention, for example. So it's kind of happening, but not yet at the level, I think, or it's not occupying a lot of the time at the international agreements. I think the way that works, and the way that I think would is the best way for the concern that you have about energy prices, about energy accessibility, to factor its way into the international negotiations. Is what the negotiations do is people set their targets, but in order to set that target, you need to come up with a set of domestic policies which are consistent with that. That's the kind of process. The US has said carbon neutral by 2050. Now, what do we need in terms of domestic policy to get there? And it's at that point across the whole of the government that the important pieces get put together. And that's where that concern, I think, needs to happen. Of course, you don't want the government to be making promises that it can't keep, or ones that will unduly punish people or harm people within their own country. But I think these two things need to be consistent. But I think it's that domestic side of saying, like, what promise is feasible, and now what are the steps to actually back this up? And it's probably not just a simple thing of like, yeah, carbon price, whatever, with whatever features to try and make it equitable. It's probably, for every country, a set of very tailored, multiple different policies covering all different sectors of the economy. It's a hard question to do, but I think that's where it happens.
I just think it's thinking of this is exactly why thinking of the climate problem by itself, I think, is not the right way to see the problem. And that you have to see that there's these trade-offs and this balancing act that all governments have to do. Like, the moral imperative of climate, which is a favorite phrase, like, well, what about the moral imperative of electricity? And so you really have to see like how the two connect to each other. And I think without that, it's going to be very hard to make progress.
I want to conclude with a final question from Joseph, who asks a really great question. He says, classic tragedy of the commons problem. And he writes, I welcome your thoughts on the role of advocacy and individual duty to be part of the climate solution of reducing and removing carbon. And I would just add as an addendum there, how should we see individual duty versus the systemic changes driven by economics that you two have been talking about?
I have an answer. Amir, do you want to start? Or
yeah, I'll go for it. The role, of course, is a role for an individual, but the most important role is that we use our voice to make sure that the people who will make the policies consistent with something which is a planet where we have a more equitable future, those are the people making and writing the policies. I think that's the most powerful thing we can do as individuals. All of these other ideas come up about, changing your consumption habits. And of course, that's going to need to happen. To some extent, we'll be changing the way we drive. We'll be changing the way we like buy all of our stuff, where it gets made. But the most power that the individual can have, apart from making sure this is at the top of your priority list with everybody around you, is to make sure that you make that reflected in the politics in the country or the region where you are.
Yeah, I completely agree with Amir. And I just want to point to an example, like 7 years ago, 7 years ago, like if you talked about Beijing, all you talked about was like the air pollution apocalypse. And now China is not like probably at the frontier of people, first in line in people's minds of terms of a democratic nation. But there, the people demanded that something happened to air pollution, and like it happened. And that they're undergoing this incredible transformation with respect to air pollution. And so I think that speaks to what Amir is saying. I want to make a second point, though, and it's not to undermine political movements, is I think that people think about the climate problem in a binary way, like, should we have climate change or should we not? Or what can we do about the climate problem? And like, too late, folks, that's done. We got climate change. And there's no changing that. And I think what we now have in front of us is kind of a marginal decision, like how much climate change should we have? Do we want like the super duper scary version, or do we want something more moderate? And there, I think like individual actions can matter, but I think you have to bring a certain ruthlessness to it, like. Does recycling matter, or composting your coffee grounds? No, they don't matter to a first approximation. Like, you have to like ruthlessly search for the best way to reduce your tons. And there are ways to do that. And I think, and in that way, you're contributing to like modulating the dial a little bit, like how much climate change we should have. And I think that's a totally important and fruitful thing for people to do. And the enormity of the climate problem I think, can cause people to dive under the table. But I think thinking of it as a marginal one maybe is a slightly different way to think about it, and can be helpful.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the insights from Michael and Amir today, and also from everybody out there in the audience. Really great questions. Next time we do this and we're live, I'm going to ask everybody to raise your hand if you drive an electric car. So between now and then, maybe go out and buy one if you can afford it. They are still expensive from a sticker price perspective, as Michael pointed out earlier. But this has been really great. And I want to hand over things back to Deneen for some closing remarks.
Wow, thank you so much, Professors Greenstone and Jina, for sharing your knowledge and your insights. It was a wonderful session. And thank you so much, Amy, for moderating. For more information about tonight's topic, we recommend visiting michaelgreenstone.com and the Energy Policy Institute's website at epic.uchicago.edu. If you'd like to hear more from Professor Greenstone, listen to the UChicago Big Brains podcast from June 21st, 2018, about climate change's human cost. Visit bigbrains.uchicago.edu. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.